So my name's Delaney Zayac, and this is IceCap Organics. My wife and I started IceCap Organics in 2009. We're in the Pemberton Meadows. We grow mixed organic vegetables, sell them all locally in Vancouver and the Sea to Sky. So our farm is 5 acres of total land that we own, and then we lease a little half-acre chunk just right across the road. Yeah, I think we're managing a total of 10 acres, but only 5.5 of it is actually in production. The rest is wilderness, wildlands, and tree patches and stuff. Our practices, like our philosophy on how we should farm and how we do farm and how that translates to reality. It is a huge question. There's a lot there. There's so many different ways of farming, and a farm is sort of a reflection of the personalities of the farmer in some ways. Farming it's an expression of our values and our ideals and beliefs. We started definitely with the idea of being organic. That was a no-brainer. We never even considered using pesticides or herbicides or chemicals of any kind. That's sort of the basis, the fundamental kind of structure that we built up on. But right away we started realizing that organic is not enough on its own. You can farm organically and be certified organic and still kill the soil and kill the land. You can still farm organically and be unsustainable. Through research and talking to other farmers and then seeing it with my own eyes and doing my own soil tests and just monitoring crops and soil health, I realized that what we were doing for the first few years, it was good. It was a good start. We were learning, but we were kind of overworking our soil, and we weren't finding the time to do enough cover cropping. We weren't finding the time to really take care of the soil. We weren't using enough compost. We were really asking a lot of our topsoil. It was able to handle it, and we were getting really good crops, and we just learned very quickly. By year 3, we were putting on a lot more compost, and we were doing a lot more cover cropping. We started dedicating certain areas of the field to rest so that we could put it into cover crop and rebuild the soil. We started trying different cover crops, and just right away we started realizing like there's a lot more to this than just not using chemicals. And that's the tip of the iceberg of what organic means. You know, you do have to have a plan for soil health. We wanted to go further than that, but it's a work in progress. It's still also like it has to translate to a viable business, right? Like we're trying to make a living, so we need to keep that in mind. So we do have to have enough cash crops to do that, but we need to have this farm be just as productive and more. In 20 years when I retire, I want to walk away and feel like this land is better than when I started farming on it. Like better organic matter, more fertility, and less weed problems. And I think right now it is better than it was 13 years ago when we started, but it's only incrementally better. And I feel like we can do a lot more with that. So at this point, we're dedicating a third of our growing area into a 3-year cover crop rotation. And within that third of the area, we wanted to try some other things on it. And no-till was sort of a way that we could trial some ideas and try some different things that would maybe work their way into our growing practices in general. Like ultimately, the kernel of it, the thesis of my philosophy towards growing is I want to leave the land better than it was when I started. So everything kind of derives from that. The no-till thing is a way to speed up that positive shift in the soil. You look at that topsoil and you see it's such a living thing. Like there's just so much going on in there. There's the soil web, the mycorrhiza, all the microbial activity that's going on in there, the earthworms, everything. We add so much nutrients to that, organic fertilizers and compost, and then we till it up. We kind of ruffle everything up in there and it starts all over again, and it has tons of nutrients so we can grow a nice big cabbage or whatever it is we're growing. But we keep disturbing that sort of natural web of life that's happening in that soil. I think that to some degree, we need to keep doing that for some crops. I think in the long run, like I'm talking like 5 to 10 years down the road, I'd like to have at least half of our farm not being tilled every year, and maybe only being tilled once every 3 years or something like that. You can be getting the benefits of having a cover crop, but you can also be pulling crops off the top without tilling the soil. So there's kind of a business benefit to it there too. and there's also just a overall soil health. So the other thing is sequestering carbon has to become a part of the idea of soil fertility. So it's not direct, it's indirect. When we're sequestering carbon, basically like sunshine comes down, plants grow carbon, plants shed root matter into the soil, it becomes organic matter, that's carbon. It stabilizes in the soil. The soil web, like the fungal web, helps process that into stable carbon. So we're sequestering carbon by having a cover crop or by doing no-till. When we bust that land open tilling, we release a bunch of that carbon. Not all of it, but we release some of it. Basically, we started last year with the idea that we just wanted to try a bit of no-till out in the area that we had in cover crop. So we had been doing some reading and learning, and we'd read about a successful no-till farm where they were using this system where they would have a cover crop, they would mow it where the beds were going to be, they would keep the cover crop in the walkways, and then they would add amendments and then put paper down. So craft paper, no dyes, just recycled packing paper, like the brown paper basically, and use that as a weed barrier and lay that down and then put a bunch of compost on top of that paper. One of the things that should be said about that is the long-term goal there is to not have to use the paper anymore. So the paper is what we're using to establish the bed. After a few years of doing that, there should be enough of a layer of broken down plant residue and compost that it creates like a mat that suppresses weed seed germination. And you know, every time you till the ground, you fluff up a bunch of ancient weed seeds that come up and germinate and go to seed and all that. So by not tilling it, over time we should make a better, like less of a weed seed bank germinating all the time. And here's some of that paper that's mostly broken down. But the idea with the paper is that it will break down into the soil over time, but while the plant's establishing itself and growing, it just keeps the weeds down except for where the hole that you made to plant the plants. So we thought it was a neat idea. We thought maybe we could just try it out. So we just did a couple beds. We did all those things, just like I said, we just amended about the same as we normally would with our tilled earth crops. And you know, some of it worked, some of it didn't. It was just a little trial. So this year we expanded it. We did twice as much, and we took a lot more time putting quite a bit more compost down and really getting that paper like covered 100% in the compost. Weeding is the organic farmer's nemesis. It's what we do so much of. So basically we're trying to figure out a way to use a weed barrier and then plant through it. So we're using transplants, we're not using direct seed plants. And so here we are in year 2, and we're having some success. So that technique again, like we're doing soil tests and then we're putting amendments down, so whether that be fish bone meal or organic granular fertilizers or just compost, whatever the farmer thinks they want to use, whatever your ideas are there, putting that paper down and then putting a whole bunch more compost on top to keep that paper secure and in place, and then planting through that. And then we're using overhead irrigation to water it in. We found watering it required more water initially to get plants established because it takes a while to get through the paper and the layers of compost, but once it was wet, it stayed wet and needed maybe a quarter of the amount of watering that regular tilled earth needs. Seeing a lot of promise, but also seeing there's a lot more to learn here, and we're just kind of at the initial stage figuring things out. Big thing that we're seeing is that crops that kind of shade out weeds and canopy out on their own, like this cabbage and like the kale, have done relatively well, considering we haven't done anything but plant it and then water it, and that was it. There's lots of harvestable crops there. Crops that need consistent weeding, like we have some onions here, they've had a bit of a harder time because the weeds have come up and they just don't compete well. So learning there. Okay, so year 1, this area, well, it had been a tilled crop in a regular crop rotation, and then we decided to give it some rest. The fall previous to year 1, we seeded it with fall rye and crimson clover, and those tend to do well. They overwinter, they work well together. It makes a nice weed kind of barrier too, not much can grow through it. So that was doing really good. We had a nice established cover crop. So that was 3 years ago. And then the next year, we tried a couple no-till beds. The cover crop was still doing really well. And then this year, it came up pretty decent in the spring, but it kind of started dying off in the last heat wave. We mowed it because the weeds were coming through, and it hasn't really come back up. You can see we have lots of clover, but the fall rye is pretty much gone now. That's where we're at. We'll have to mow all of our crops in, and we'll probably try to reseed a walkway cover crop. But we're gonna keep the beds themselves as just mowed and then maybe just seed over top. We're not gonna till them. We'll just keep the weeds down by mowing. It's also important to mention we had this cover crop going. We did some no-till beds on it. The cover crop was tired and getting on in the years, and we want to establish a vigorous stand of cover crop that we can try some other no-till things with. We actually tilled the cover crop in this no-till trial area, just only a shallow till where we just scruffled up the top basically to kill all the weeds, to knock the weeds down, and then we're gonna grow rye, and then we'll try oats in another spot, and we'll also have some clover in here. We have done a light till along the top, and that's mainly because that's just the equipment that we have, and we can't afford a no-till seed drill or a bunch of new equipment for the trial. But we will establish a new cover crop here, and then we'll continue on with this area as a no-till area. But to get a cover crop established, we did have to till a little bit. So I've kind of outlined this method of no-till that we're trying with the compost and the paper. I'd really like to try to grow a thick, tall stand of cover crop and then crimp it and try no-till that way. So that's something I think I'd like to see squash in that kind of a situation. Some farms that we've been following and some books we've been reading show a lot of success with this, like growing like a really tall, thick cover crop, getting it to go conical like right before it goes to seed, and then crimping that stand down and breaking the stems basically, and making a really thick, really effective weed barrier and moisture keeper, and then planting right through that residue. Like from what I'm seeing, it's a lot of things like sorghum sedan grass, really fast, vigorous crops that just produce like a whole load of organic matter as well, and just produces enough volume to make a thick layer that weeds can't grow through. So that's sort of the crucial thing here. Like it's all self-evident how no-till is good for the soil, but we have to be able to have the soil not tilled and plant a crop in it, and the crop to thrive without having to do a bunch of hand weeding. You can't make this a viable business if you're just hand weeding everything. It has to be, on the tilled earth, we're using mechanical cultivation to keep the weeds down. In a no-till context, there has to be some sort of a weed barrier. So that's a crucial, like, technical part that you have to understand from the farmer's perspective. Over here we have some squash that we tried. We just had too many squash transplants, so we decided to throw a trial in here. We did the same thing with the paper and the amendments and compost, but we actually ran out of our proper finished high grade, high quality compost, and we just had to use some like kind of unfinished farm compost. We also had a lot of birds pecking up the paper. We have a lot of weeds coming through the paper weed barrier. The squash is not even half as big as our tilled earth squash. So this is sort of like an example of where it didn't work, and we have to learn a lot to make this kind of work. Like one of the things that we're realizing with certain crops, we use a black fabric, like a landscape fabric, to warm the soil up. The squash that we've planted on black fabric, tilled earth, and then black fabric, not black plastic, it's like actual like woven fabric that we reuse year after year. It is so far ahead of this squash. By now, this time of the year, the soil's warm everywhere, but the soil is so cold in the shoulder seasons that having that black color really heats the soil up a lot faster. So one of the things we thought we could try is we could use that same fabric just over top of no-till prep as a weed barrier and as a way to warm the soil up. So that would be the first thing. And then the other one was to try a tall stand of something, whether it be sedan grass or maybe oats or something, and then let that winter kill and then plant the squash through that, just to maybe liven up the soil a bit more, and then compost and fabric over that Yeah, so those are the ideas there, and using a better quality compost too would be a good one. So that's a perfect example of just how this is a trial and we don't know what we're doing and we're learning as we go here, you know, like this is a total failure, but it's only a failure in terms of it making marketable crop. It's a success in terms of learning from it. There's tons to be gleaned from every one of these beds, the ones that worked and the ones that don't work. So yeah, that's a good trial. Yeah, so here we are with this sweet corn that we planted here, and this is a good example of where you can actually see, well, that's the leftover of the compost that we put on top of the paper, and then here's the paper still intact, and it's done a really good job of keeping the weeds down. The only weeds that I see growing are really ones that are growing like in the hole that we made to plant the corn. That's kind of the goal. Yeah, so anyways, if I rip the paper open, like it's pretty tough. And underneath, I can just see there's a whole bunch of layer of like this kind of, it's all like these roots and soil web. It's quite dry. The corn has a taproot that goes way down, so I'm not worried about that. But look at all this soil web action going on in here. Like there's just so much of this stuff. And we can go to the tilled earth corn, and it's just a totally different story. I'm getting into more and more just like chunks of breaking down organic matter. Yeah, so there's just lots going on in this soil. And again, like that depth of disturbance that I've just done there, that's the deepest this chunk of soil has been disturbed to. So this is just 3 years. So it's starting to build up into a really alive soil web. That's kind of the goal here. I'm hoping to gain fertility from that live soil web, so by not disturbing it. So post-harvest, so what are we gonna do with this land like after we get a crop or it doesn't make a crop or whatever the trial ends up doing? We're basically gonna harvest what we do, like say we take some leaves off this kale, we take the corn cobs out, and then we're mowing. So we're using a flail mower and our regular farm tractor. That tractor's width straddles the bed so that there's never a tire driving on the actual bed surface. There's just a tire driving in the walkways. And then the flail mower, it's not like a lawnmower where it just cuts everything down. It pulverizes the residue, whatever's left of the crop. So all of this is gonna just get pulverized into basically like a pulp. And then it will mow right to the ground level. We won't actually mow the ground, but we'll mow to like an inch above the ground. So there'll just be a tiny bit of stubble sticking up, and then there'll just be a lot of like crop matter laying right on top of the bed. Then at that point we have a choice. We can either seed it with cover crop. Maybe we do something like that will winter kill if there's enough time left in the growing season to get any benefit from that. So if we were mowing now, we could maybe seed with oats, and then it would winter kill, and then we'd be ready to plant again in this bed something else next year. Or if it's like kale, we'll be harvesting it into the fall, and then we'll just mow it, and then it'll snow. And then the bed will just be dormant over winter. Following spring, it'll actually look pretty tidy until weeds start coming up, so we'll have to put a weed barrier down and plant it again right away. So no-till in terms of how does it work with climate change, with the new kind of heat waves and forest fires and just the new potential drought situations or flooding even? That's a good question, because every change we make to our kind of agricultural practices have to start being geared to deal with those new challenges. Last year we had repressive heat waves that were just so hot and for so much longer than we normally have. We saw crops die off. We saw watering issues, like we couldn't water enough with our current well. We felt like there was a glimmer of hope with the no-till situation in that once the crops are established, you don't need to water as much. We still need to bear that out more, but it seems like the system holds moisture a lot better. So that's the one thing that jumps right out. I feel like in Pemberton, things are generally too wet until the peak of the summer when it gets quite dry, and then we're watering quite a bit. So right off the bat, no-till helped with holding water, holding moisture in the soil. So that's a twofold thing. It's the system that we're using with the layer of compost and that one layer of paper, and then over time just layer of crop residue, just kind of acting as a moisture barrier and just keeping moisture in the soil rather than having just open tilled earth just evaporating water out constantly. So there's that. But then there's also like building organic matter is absolutely crucial in terms of holding soil moisture. So it's sort of twofold in that way. So in theory, it should be much more drought resistant. And plus you're having so much ground cover cropped, that cover crop really holds moisture as well. So maybe threefold. The next thing is our shoulder seasons are really wet. And some of the best growing land around is the same way. The Fraser Valley can be seen that way too. The vast majority of our moisture falls in the winter and then into the spring. Sometimes our fields are too wet. Even though daytime temperatures are warm enough to grow, we will have too much moisture in the field to till and make beds. Not tilling takes that out of the equation because the soil being wet is great to plant in. Like if I have a whole bunch of cabbages I want to plant out and it's early April and it's been raining for 2 weeks straight, if I need to till a bed to make a bed to plant those cabbages, I have to wait till the soil dries out. If I'm not tilling and all I'm doing is laying down a weed barrier and then planting into the soil, I should be able to get on my land way sooner. So I'm talking about like a tangible, noticeable difference. Like I think that we'll be able to get on land 2 to 3 weeks, maybe even 4 weeks sooner with a solid no-till plan, especially if it's well thought out and implemented the year before. So bed's already established and ready to go. So I see that happening. I see less soil compaction from all the tractor work creates better drainage. When you do have too much moisture, when you're getting too much rain, snow melt coupled with spring rain causes a lot of water pooling. Those are the big things that stick out for me. And then there's this extra bonus of having the soil becoming more fertile from it being alive and in all those biological processes happening from not being tilled. You probably have less inputs and you don't have to use as much fertilizer. Here we are in the patch of cabbage that was planted at the same time as the no-till red cabbage, but planted in our conventional way of like tilled earth. Basically, right? We put compost, same amendments, but we're tilling the land so that the soil is you know, like you typically imagine garden soil to be. So in this particular case, the cabbage is almost identical in terms of what stage it's at, in terms of the amount of weeds. So cabbage is definitely a crop that is working well for us for no-till because it looks pretty much the same. If we look at the soil more carefully, we've just watered here, so the color is going to be a bit different just because it's wetter. It's like much looser. There's a lot less going on in that soil. It's soil. There's a few roots here and there, but it's not as alive. This is what a farmer that's growing normally wants so that they can weed really easily, right? Like I can bring a machine through here and weed right up to the plants really easily. But this soil's been tilled way down here and it's been busted up and the soil web has been disturbed. I'm seeing that as being a long-term problem for the health of the soil.
Yeah, hi, my name is Geesing. I'm the Provincial Soil Specialist for the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Well, we have noticed then over decades of tilling that there are in some cases almost disastrous results. Perhaps the most obvious one is when you work on a slope. When you remove the cover that protects the soil from the impact of water, or even you see here, if you cut those roots that keep actually the soil in place, you increase the susceptibility of the soil to erosion substantially. Other things that happen in your soil is you destroy now the aggregates, and those aggregates are important for infiltration, important for gas exchange. Those aggregates also the one that protect actually your soil organic matter, and when that is exposed, then it decomposes much faster, and then you lose capacities, or you reduce the capacity to retain water or to retain nutrients. You also deprive your microorganisms of food source, and that reduces biological activity, and it reduces also the biological diversity, which is an asset when you combat pathogens. So when we talk about aggregates, it's those clumps, if you want, of different sizes, and they hold on a high level. They're held together by roots, and when you go a little bit further down on the microscopic level, then you have very small aggregates, You can't see them with your naked eye if you want, but those small aggregates are the protection of your soil organic matter. And this is also, these aggregates are held together then by actual particles, the sand, and also some organic matter. And they are the result of the goo of microorganisms. These are sugars, and so that they kind of stick them together on a very small level. And together they provide this structure of your soil, which then dictates how well water infiltrates, how much air you have available, and how microbial activity is flourishing, because microorganisms need both air and water. Another thing that is related to good structure is those aggregates provide a natural resistance to compaction. And when you till, you destroy that natural resistance. And in fact, you start a vicious circle. So you do address in the beginning compaction problem, which makes actually your soil, because it loses its capacity to have natural resistance to compaction, makes it more vulnerable to compaction. And it goes on, and then you actually have created a dependence of your soil to keep on addressing compaction by tillage. So an easy test to see how stable your aggregates and those aggregates that hold your soil together is when you take a glass of water and some chicken wire, and then you place carefully that aggregate inside, and you observe that for a while. And well, it should actually stay intact. If you have a soil where the structure was destroyed, and sometimes it's naturally, you will see after a few minutes it dissolves. Nothing holds it in place. Today's maybe not the best example because the soil is relatively wet. You want to do that with drier soil, so it has some moisture here. But I think you do get the gist of that. It's staying intact, so that's what you want to see. If you had, let's say, a farm that has tilled over years, you would probably observe the whole thing dissolves. Within a few minutes, it's gone, right? If a farmer asks me, shall I switch to no-till, then my almost standard answer is it's an absolutely valid alternative to conventional tillage. But before you switch to that, there are a few considerations that you need to take into account. One is that do not expect miracles. It will take some time for those changes to set in. And farmers I talk to, the time frame is often 5 years and plus.
I imagine that those beds in 20 years are going to be super fertile, and you dig in that soil and it's going to be full of life and very active. Whereas if I keep tilling this soil for 20 years, oh man, it's going to be pretty tired, right? Like there's going to be very little organic matter left. But I mean, we're still able to grow great crops like this. This is still a viable way to grow food, and I'm not knocking it. This is still how most of my farm is being managed. But I see a way to increase our sustainability and our ecosystem, soil health, everything by tilling less.